If you'll recall, a while back I received a sample set of paints to try out and provide some feedback. As I was unpacking these, I made the decision that I would test them out on some miniatures that I received at about the same time. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to paint up this bloodwork miniature using a sample set of acrylic miniature paints that I received from Mr. Pigments. And while I'm at it, I'm going to knock out this adorable little first player marker from Nemesis Retaliation. Additionally, as a little bonus, I'm going to perform a direct comparison between this paint and Pro Acryl's Expert Artist Series paints. You'll definitely want to stick around for this premium paint comparison. So let's get started, and welcome to Trehane Miniatures. As previously mentioned, these paints were provided to me by Mr. Pigments at no cost to me, so bear that in mind as I talk about them. Also bear in mind that I have no reason to lie to you or mislead you. It's not like I'm getting paid for this. Ultimately, Mr. Pigments is looking for feedback on this paint line. Therefore, this isn't really going to be a full review video, but I will be sharing my thoughts on each paint in the set. The developer of this paint line is a former automotive paint specialist and current miniature painting enthusiast who is developing a line of highly pigmented single pigment paints for dedicated miniature painting hobbyists. These paints are being produced without opacifiers like white, black, or grays, so they're ideal for mixing custom paint colors. If you have any questions or would like more technical information about this product line, I'll direct you to the Mr. Pigments YouTube channel through a link in the description down below. Also, these paints are currently only available directly through Mr. Pigments, I believe through the Mr. Pigments Ko-Fi account. Before getting started with the paints, I used Colorforge's Tempest Blue Primer to prepare the miniature for painting. This will act as the shadow layer for the piece. Tempest Blue is noticeably lighter than the usual Midnight Blue primer that I like to use, so this primer isn't a replacement for Midnight Blue, but I think it'll work well as a shadow color for the green skin on this guy. For this paint test, I decided to use the paints just as I would in my normal daily painting sessions. I grabbed a couple of miniatures that I want to paint, and I'm going to use these paints to paint them. I'm not doing any cliche paint tests like painting swatches of color over black and white primers. I'm not doing a durability test such as scratching the surface with a metal screw, nor am I testing the glossiness of the finish by holding it under a bright light. This is not how I use paints. Even if I did these tests, I have no basis of comparison for the results. The first thing that I want to try with these new paints is to run them through an airbrush. I prepared the Pyrrole Red as I would with any other paint, using Vallejo airbrush thinner as well as a little flow improver added to the cup. The red paint flows beautifully through the airbrush, and I was able to quickly establish a red bounce light effect coming from below the miniature. Next, I tried titanium white through the airbrush to create an area for the moonlight glow on the back side of the miniature. In order to test several colors through the airbrush, I'm going to spray 3 areas of the miniature with different colored light sources. For the moonlight on the back, I'll come back later with titanium white to further intensify the highlights. Then I will glaze these highlights with some phthalo blue. Right now, I'm simply using a light mist of white to guide my light placement for the moonlight. This titanium white flows nicely through the airbrush just as the Pyrrole Red did. Finally, I used bismuth yellow through the airbrush to represent the area where natural light would hit the character. I don't usually do this when prepping a model for painting, but I wanted to run as many colors through the airbrush as this small miniature would permit. Most of this yellow will get painted over with a standard brush. Even though I'm not building this up to full opacity, I can see that this yellow is very vibrant with fantastic coverage. The bismuth yellow is where I began having issues with the airbrush. I thinned the yellow in the same manner as I did with the other paints, but the airbrush began spitting paint and eventually clogging as the application progressed. Even after rinsing and flushing the airbrush as normal between colors, globs of bismuth yellow remained in the area below the needle. I disassembled the airbrush and gave it a thorough cleaning. There is apparently a compatibility issue with Vallejo thinner and the acrylic medium in these paints. Vallejo thinner is formulated to prevent their Vallejo paints from gumming up, whereas these new paints are compatible with the formulation found in the golden airbrush medium. I wasn't aware of this before I started, but I'm aware of it now. I've had this same issue when combining Vallejo thinner with Army Painter paints, but at the time I just thought it was because the Army Painter was an inferior product. Now I may have to reevaluate that situation as well. I also ran some quinacridone magenta through the airbrush to establish the base for a pink OSL glow on Howie here. Howie the Duck, Build Platypus. Of the two most common pigments used for magenta, this one has a deep and rich red-violet coloration to it, and is less pink than the other most common magenta pigment choice. This could be my favorite paint in the entire line, and I put it to good use on both of these models. And yes, that is a dark plum looking base layer on this guy. I'll show how I made that when I get to the brushwork part of this discussion. This magenta paint worked exceptionally well through the airbrush with no issues at all. And now is where the real fun begins. I'm going to mix up a couple of different green shades. I'm going to use phthalo blue and bismuth yellow for one of the colors, and I'll use a mix of cobalt teal and bismuth yellow for the other. From here on out, I'm using a standard brush for all of the painting. My preconceived notion is that the phthalo blue mix will create a darker green than the cobalt teal mix because, you know, the phthalo blue looks darker than the cobalt teal. But as we'll see, when I mix up some violets, phthalo blue and cobalt teal don't always affect the final color of the mix as one might expect. So right now, I'm continuing to add phthalo blue to the yellow until I get a nice dark shadow color for the green skin. By the way, I watched so many episodes of The Joy of Painting as a youngster that phthalo blue just easily rolls off the tongue. And I'm wondering, should I start pronouncing phthalo blue correctly, or should I continue saying phthalo blue as an homage to the late great Bob Ross? Personally, I prefer the latter. Next, I use cobalt teal and bismuth yellow to mix up a lighter, brighter green, with beautiful results. Just like the darker green before, the coverage with this paint is excellent, and all this with just a single pigment in each bottle. I was informed that the goal with these paints is to achieve maximum opacity by using a higher concentration of pigment rather than including additional pigments such as black and white. While this ends up being more costly to produce, the colors are more vibrant and true. I think that the biggest benefit to single pigment paints is that they mix more predictably. Mixing pure magenta and phthalo blue, for example, will yield a very nice looking violet without the unwanted side effects that additional pigments like black and white can have in the mix. Finally, I add a little titanium white to the light green for a final highlight. And I even bring in a little more yellow so that the color doesn't get too washed out, or too desaturated. I then proceed to highlight in my usual fashion. Someone in the comments has requested an orc skin video from me. Maybe I'll use extended footage from this session for a specific orc skin video. I really do like how these highlights are turning out. Alright, let's take a quick look at the pure titanium white. We've already seen it work through the airbrush. Now I'm going to quickly scratch in some highlights for the moonlight glow. It works very predictably for precise painting highlights as well as a little dry brushing. It has great opacity and a nice smooth finish. You really can't ask for more from titanium white. I significantly thin down the phthalo blue and then glaze it over the titanium white highlights on the back. This is performing extremely well. The phthalo blue pigment is kind of transparent to start, so I don't know if I need to thin it down as much as I did, but I think the results speak for themselves. I then use pure pyrrole red to bolster the intensity of the red OSL glow that was initially placed with the airbrush. Geez, I do so many freaking painting tutorials that it's become my default mode. I need to focus on the paints or we'll be here all day. The coverage and opacity with this pyrrole red is pretty insane. I'll show you a little later just how thin this paint consistency is, which makes its coverage even more remarkable. Also, the matte finish of these paints is achieved by using more pigment in the mix rather than relying on the finish quality of the medium used in the mix. I think this is pretty cool, and it's not something that I was aware of as an option. I always assumed that the matte paints were matte because they used matte acrylic medium. And as usual, I use titanium white to edge highlight the red, and then I go over that with another tight layer of pyrrole red, which makes the OSL look even more intense. There are 3 browns included in this sample set of paints: burnt umber, burnt sienna, and manganese brown. Burnt umber is the first ho-hum paint that I've run across in this set. It pains me to say that. I don't have any issues with the color or transparency of this paint, but the feel of it just feels off to me. To me, it feels like the gel medium from the original Army Painter line. I'm not going to belabor this point. From what I understand, this specific paint is being discontinued until a better burnt umber pigment can be sourced. Alright, while I regain my composure after painting with the burnt umber, I lay down some Mars Black red shade for the hair, armor, and swords. And it's perfect. Okay, on to burnt sienna. This is my favorite color out of the three browns, but not necessarily my favorite paint of the three. The consistency of this paint is quite thin and perfect for layering, but at the same time, it does have decent enough coverage to use as a base coat. I'm also using burnt sienna as a thin glaze over the cape. I really like how the yellow that I applied through the airbrush is interacting with the blue of the cape to create these cool green highlight shapes. I don't want to destroy these awesome shapes, but I also don't want a blue and green cape. This glaze will help neutralize the vibrant colors, and after scratching in some additional highlights and texture, we'll end up with something much more suitable for this character. I also used burnt sienna to base coat Howie's gold visor, and even glazed it around the brighter reflections of the visor to add some depth to the piece. Speaking of Howie, let's get up to speed with his painting using some pinks and violets, and then I'll show you how amazing manganese brown is. I'm mixing up 4 variations of violet to see which one is going to work best as my overall shadow color for the entire piece. I'm using phthalo blue and cobalt teal to mix with pyrrole red and quinacridone magenta in pairs. First, I mix cobalt teal with the magenta. My instinct tells me that this pair will make the brightest and most vibrant purple hue. My instincts are wrong. After I mix up each color, I paint a swatch on a white piece of paper so that I can compare all of the colors side by side. Next, I mix the magenta with phthalo blue. Phthalo blue can be quite overpowering when mixed with other colors, so I'll have to use a proportionately larger amount of magenta in this mix. This produces a very iconic royal purple color that is exactly what I imagine purple to be. But I'm not looking for iconic purple. I'm looking for a shadow color, so I use pyrrole red and mix it with phthalo blue. I anticipate that this will produce a muddy violet color that leans toward a brownish hue. This may be perfect for a shadow color in the right circumstances, but I wouldn't really consider it violet. Finally, I mix pyrrole red and cobalt teal together. This was by far the least appealing combination in my opinion. I had to use a bit more red and push it towards a red-violet color to make it look like something I'd actually use. After comparing all 4 colors side by side, I decide on the cobalt teal and quinacridone magenta mix for the shadow color. It applies very smoothly and has just the right amount of translucency that lets the black primer affect the finished look of this layer. Once I've got the entire model covered, I could not be happier with this choice of color. I've already demonstrated how well quinacridone magenta works through the airbrush to establish the base for the pink OSL. So now I'll mix up some pinks to finish off this pink glow. I start by mixing up something akin to dark hot pink. I'm using only quinacridone magenta and titanium white for these mixes. Quinacridone magenta can be a little transparent on its own. The addition of titanium white not only makes it brighter, but it also adds to its opacity. The coverage is outstanding. Next, I simply take the pink up a notch with a little more titanium white and continue to increase the intensity of the pink OSL. Then I follow my usual OSL routine by using titanium white to edge highlight within the pink glow. And I follow that up with a layer of the same light pink that I mixed. Mixing my own colors for this is basically effortless and I love the results. The last bit of painting that I want to demonstrate is using manganese brown to paint the fur. Then I'll get to the direct comparison with Pro-Acryl Expert Artist Paint. This manganese brown is pretty thin to start, and I thinned it down even more out of habit. But the opacity of this color blows my mind. It produces instantaneous single coat coverage. I was expecting a gentler transition from the purple to the brown near the pink OSL, but I'll have to go back and glaze that transition later. Don't get me wrong, this is overwhelmingly a positive in my book. This paint is incredible. The application here is solely due to my inexperience with this specific paint. Instead of simply adding titanium white to the manganese brown for the highlights, I first introduce bismuth yellow. I don't really care for how browns look when brightened only with white, so I want more of a golden brown look before I lighten it. This yellow has a ton of pigment in it, so I need to draw in a little more brown before adding the white. Naturally, I layer these highlights in several applications. I add a little more white and yellow as needed for each additional layer. I will come out with a full painting tutorial for Howie the duck-billed platypus in the near future, for those of you who are interested in continuing to paint your Nemesis collection with me. And now for the part that we've all been waiting for. How does this paint compare to Pro Acryl's Expert Artist Series paint? Initially, I was under the impression that this particular line of Pro Acryl paints consisted of single pigment paints intended to be used for mixing. However, this is not the case. My intention is to do an apples-to-apples comparison of identical pigments in a single pigment formula. Looking at the Pro Acryl Magenta, I can see that this isn't going to happen. First of all, it uses the other common magenta pigment that is more pink than the one used in Mr. Pigment's paint line. Not a bad thing, just different. It also contains a white pigment and a red pigment in the tube. My guess is that Monument Hobbies added the white to increase the opacity of the paint and then added the red pigment to keep it from appearing too pink. This is certainly a more cost-effective way to increase the opacity of a paint, but not necessarily the best way to go if you're looking to mix your own paint colors. Even their primary yellow has titanium white pigment added, and some of their paints have black pigment included in the mix. The issue that I found with including black and white pigments in colored paints is with mixing. Mixing a color that contains black pigment with one that contains white pigment creates a gray that desaturates the color of the final mix. So this brings us to Pyrrole Red, the one perfect match between the two paint lines. They both use the same red pigment with no additional pigments listed on their labels. Let's begin with the Pro Acryl. I think that Pro Acryl Pyrrole Red is universally loved by hobby painters and certainly is one of their flagship colors. These expert artist paints are heavy-bodied acrylic paints, as can easily be seen here. Under normal circumstances, I would absolutely thin this before applying it to a model. But I'm not painting a model at the moment. I'm going to test a variety of paint consistencies and brush stroke pressure to see what we can produce. And just disregard this first stroke. This is full thickness and I shouldn't have gone over it multiple times with the brush. I will use a single stroke application of each paint for the comparison. The second stroke is thinned a bit with water to a base layer consistency. Then I go back to the unthinned paint to try to get better coverage. You can definitely see brush strokes with this, so the stroke on the far right is the way to go when painting a model with this paint. Switching over to Mr. Pigment's Pyrrole Red, I can already see a significant difference in the thickness of the paint. This is very thin out of the bottle. I was provided with some chemical thickener that I was supposed to add to make it more like traditional hobby paints, but I decided not to. This may not be representative of the paints that you would receive, but I like it like this. And with the first stroke, all I can say is holy shit. Now this was done with a fully loaded brush and a light touch. So moving on, I wick some paint off the brush with a layer consistency to see how this performs over black. And finally, I try a stroke with what I consider to be a heavy glaze consistency. After witnessing the first glorious stroke with the Mr. Pigment's Pyrrole Red, I return once again to the Pro Acryl Pyrrole Red and load my brush at full thickness. Then I brush it across my test disc with a very light touch to achieve maximum coverage. It's not going to get any more opaque than this. Okay. We'll let these fully dry and then we'll check out the results. Alright, we have Pro Acryl on the left and Mr. Pigment's on the right. So first we'll look at the paints applied full strength with a light touch. They both look really good here, but Mr. Pigment's clearly looks better. What's most remarkable about this is that Mr. Pigment's Pyrrole Red was applied with a consistency that is perfect for painting miniatures, whereas the Pro Acryl Pyrrole Red was applied in a full heavy body form. That's pretty much all I need to see, but we'll continue. Applying Pro Acryl at a consistency that is suitable for base layer miniature painting essentially mimics the results of Mr. Pigment's glaze layer consistency. This is basically the direct result of the pigment density found in these paints. Mr. Pigment's is going for opacity through increased pigment density, which brings us to one potential downside. Cost. Pro Acryl Expert Artist Series paints retail for $7 per 30 milliliter tube, whereas Mr. Pigment's highly pigmented single pigment paints retail for $7 per 20 milliliter bottle. I say potential downside because, as the saying goes, you get what you pay for. So who are these paints for, and how would I recommend incorporating them into your painting arsenal? Well, first of all, if you're not really into miniature painting and you see painting a miniature just as a means to an end to quickly get a colorful miniature to the table, then these paints probably aren't for you. If you already own plenty of hobby paints and want to expand your horizons by exploring what can be achieved with a limited color palette, then these paints are a must. If you see your miniature painting as a form of artistic expression and enjoy painting miniatures for display, or if you take a lot of pride in the results you produce while painting, then you really should do yourself a favor and check these out. I'll rank each of these paints in tiers based on what I feel is their importance to any collection. The absolute essential colors for any collection would be the quinacridone magenta, bismuth yellow, phthalo blue green shade, and cobalt teal. I'm choosing these 4 particular paints not solely based on the fact that they are the best of the best in paint quality, but also because they are unlike anything else that I have in my collection. This is an incredibly versatile starting point. With these 4 colors plus black and white, you can make just about any color paint that you desire. If you don't already own a Pyrrole Red, then this paint would fall into the top tier of essentials as well. This is by far the best Pyrrole Red that I've ever used. But if you already own a decent Pyrrole Red, which I think most painters do, use up what you have and then add this to your collection. Next, I would look at adding Manganese Brown. This is also a top tier paint when it comes to quality and is just as impressive as the previous mentioned paints. It's also my favorite brown paint ever. The only reason I don't list this as a top essential paint is because of how easy it is to mix browns with the previously mentioned colors. Still, this paint is outstanding. Burnt Sienna is a lovely color that I'm happy to have in my collection. However, its translucency may make it a little more difficult to use, which is why I don't quite hold it in as high regard as the other previously mentioned paints. Still, I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I'd highly recommend it. Yeah, and so that's it. Be sure to check out the Mr. Pigment's YouTube channel, linked in the description down below. I would like to thank my amazing channel members for supporting all that I do on this channel. You too can support this channel by becoming a channel member using the link in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of paint snobs.